The sun had barely lifted over the Arizona horizon when the first gunshot shattered the dawn silence. Sheriff Jackson Hayes was already awake, brewing coffee that tasted of tin and regret, when the crack of the Colt echoed through the dusty streets of Iron Horse. His weathered hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, fingers brushing against the worn grip that had become an extension of himself through years of necessity. At 45, Hayes moved with the deliberate economy of a man who'd survived enough battles to know that rush movements get men killed. The wound in his right thigh, a permanent souvenir from the Apache campaigns, pulled tight as he stepped onto the weather-beaten porch of the jailhouse. His eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of a dust-caked hat, narrowed against the rising sun. Two federal riders approached, trailing dust and trouble in equal measure. Between them walked a woman, hands bound before her with rough hemp rope. Even from a distance, Hayes recognized the traditional dress of the Chiricahua Apache, now torn and stained with blood that wasn't entirely dry. The woman's head was held high despite the circumstances, her steps measured and dignified, despite bare feet that left crimson prints in the pale dust. U.S. Marshal Wilson dismounted first, his polished boots hitting the ground with unnecessary force. Everything about him announced federal authority, from his immaculate coat to the gleaming badge displayed prominently on his chest. His companion, a bounty hunter whose name Hayes neither knew nor cared to learn, remained mounted, one hand resting casually on the pristine Colt at his hip. "Sheriff Hayes," Wilson acknowledged with the barest nod, "I have transfer orders from Fort Bowie." The bounty hunter yanked roughly on the rope, forcing the woman forward. Hayes studied her face, the high cheekbones, the bruise darkening beneath her left eye, and most notably, the unflinching gaze that met his own, without a trace of fear. "What's this about?" Hayes kept his voice neutral, though the muscles in his jaw tightened involuntarily. Wilson thrust a folded paper toward him. "Apache female, captured near Fort Bowie. Intelligence suggests she's been passing information to renegade bands. She's to be held here for 3 days until transport arrives to take her east." Hayes scanned the official document, noting the absence of any formal charges, trial dates, or even a name. Just a designation: native female detainee. "East for what purpose?" Hayes asked, though he already knew the answer. The bounty hunter snorted. "Auction block in St. Louis. Domestic servitude. Maybe more." His mouth twisted in a grin that revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "Government needs to recoup costs of the campaign somehow." Hayes felt something cold settle in his stomach as he folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "She got a name?" "Tried asking," Wilson replied with a shrug. "Won't speak. Most of them don't when they know what's coming." Hayes looked directly at the woman again. The dirt and blood on her dress told one story, but her eyes told another. This wasn't a broken spirit. This was a fire banked but still burning. She was watching, waiting, calculating with every breath. "I'll hold her," Hayes said flatly, taking the rope from the bounty hunter's outstretched hand. He didn't yank it or force her forward. He simply began walking, and she followed. Not out of obedience, but out of the cold logic of someone with no immediate alternatives. Inside the jailhouse, Hayes led her to the rear cell. The iron door closed with a sound like finality, the key turning with mechanical indifference. She stood facing him, her eyes finally rising to meet his. Defiant, steady, unafraid. He returned to his desk without speaking, unpinned the badge from inside his belt, and placed it on the scarred wooden surface before him. That badge hadn't been displayed on his chest for over 3 years now, not since he'd returned from the last Apache campaign with blood on his hands that no amount of justification could wash clean. The memory rose unbidden, a scout mission gone wrong, an Apache family caught in the crossfire, a boy no more than 10 trying to defend his sister with nothing but a handcrafted slingshot. Hayes had watched as his fellow scouts gunned them down without hesitation or remorse. Orders followed. Duty done. He'd stopped wearing his badge properly that day. As darkness settled over Iron Horse, the saloon down the street came alive with raucous laughter and tinny piano music. Hayes sat at his desk, a single lamp casting long shadows across the jailhouse floor. The woman, he still didn't know her name, had neither moved nor spoken since her arrival. She simply sat cross-legged on the thin mattress, hands resting on her knees, eyes fixed on some distant point. The door to the jailhouse banged open as Maddox, Wilson's hired gun, staggered and reeking of cheap whiskey and malice. "Come to see the merchandise," Maddox announced, moving toward the cell with predatory intent. "Heard they fetch good prices back east, especially the young ones." Hayes was on his feet before he'd made the conscious decision to move. "You've had enough for one night," he said, positioning himself between Maddox and the cell. "Time you headed back." Maddox's hand drifted toward his holster. "Since when do you care what happens to Apache filth? Heard you rode with Harrison during the Skeleton Canyon operation. Wasn't much mercy shown there. Was there, Sheriff?" The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Hayes felt the old weight of guilt pressed down on him, but his voice remained steady. "That was then. This is my town now. And in my town, even prisoners have rights." Maddox laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Rights? What rights? There ain't no law out here except what men like Wilson decide, and he's decided she's property, not people." Hayes moved with the sudden violence of a striking rattler. His fist connected with Maddox's jaw, sending the younger man sprawling across a wooden table that collapsed beneath his weight. Hayes stood over him, hand hovering near his holster. "In this town, I'm the law," Hayes said quietly. "And I say everyone gets treated like a human being until proven otherwise. Now get out before I decide you need accommodations for the night." Maddox wiped blood from his split lip, eyes narrowed with malice. "Wilson won't like this. Not one bit." "I'm trembling with fear," Hayes replied dryly. "Door's that way." After Maddox's departure, Hayes returned to his desk, aware of the woman's eyes on him. For the first time, he saw something other than defiance in her gaze, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even reassessment. That night, Hayes left the cell door unlocked. A test, perhaps, or an offer. By morning, she remained inside, sitting exactly as she had been, though her eyes tracked him with newfound intensity. He brought her a plate of beans and a cup of water. This time, she accepted both. "Naya," she said quietly as he turned to leave. The single word stopped him in his tracks. Her voice was surprisingly clear and cultured, at odds with her appearance. "My name is Naya." Hayes nodded once, accepting this small offering for the significant gesture it was. "Jackson Hayes," he replied, though he suspected she already knew. By mid-morning, Hayes had made his decision. He hitched his weather-done mare to a wagon. By mid-morning, Hayes had made his decision. He hitched his weather-done mare to a wagon, loaded it with supplies, and returned to the cell. "You're coming with me," he said simply, unlocking the door one final time. Naya's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Where?" "Somewhere neither Wilson nor his dogs will find you." He held out a pair of worn leather boots. "These will fit better than nothing." She studied him for a long moment, searching for deception, then accepted the boots with a small nod. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. They left Iron Horse as the town stirred to life, taking the eastern trail before cutting north toward the rugged terrain of Hidden Canyon. Hayes drove the wagon with practiced ease, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. Beside him, Naya sat in wary silence, her hands no longer bound, but her spirit still guarded. "You're making yourself a target," she said finally, as the town disappeared behind them. Hayes kept his eyes on the trail. Wouldn't be the first time. Why risk it for an Apache woman? The question hung in the air between them. Hayes considered several answers before settling on the simplest truth. Because what they're doing isn't right, and I've stood by watching wrong things happen for too many years. The canyon appeared before them as the sun reached its zenith, a jagged tear in the earth, its walls rising like natural fortifications. Hayes guided the wagon along a barely visible path, navigating switchbacks and narrow passages until they reached a small clearing nestled against the western wall. There, partially hidden by stunted pines, stood a cabin built more for defense than comfort. My brother's place, Hayes explained as they dismounted, before the war. The interior was spare but functional, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves stocked with the necessities for extended isolation. A rifle rack held a Winchester repeater and a heavy Sharps 50 caliber, a buffalo gun with enough stopping power to drop a man at 1,000 yards. Hayes moved through the cabin with the familiarity of long habit, checking supplies and sightlines. From each window, he had clear views of all possible approaches. The cabin had been built by a man who understood that survival often depended on seeing trouble before it saw you. On the eastern wall hung a faded map marked with the locations of Apache camps and military outposts, a relic from Hayes' scouting days. Beside it, a daguerreotype of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Your wife? Naya asked, surprising him with the question. Hayes nodded once. Ellen. Lost her to fever 3 winters back. I'm sorry, she offered, and the simple words carried unexpected weight. War and disease, Hayes replied. They take without asking. That first night, they maintained their distance. Hayes took the floor near the door, rifle within arm's reach, while Naya claimed the cot. Neither fully trusted sleep to come in the presence of someone who had been, until recently, the enemy. Morning brought a tentative shift. Hayes found Naya examining the Sharps rifle with knowledgeable hands. You know firearms, he observed, neither questioning nor accusing. My father was an interpreter for the Army at Fort Thomas, she replied, before they decided he knew too much. Her fingers traced the heavy barrel. He taught me about white men's weapons, said knowledge was the only defense we had left. You're English, Hayes noted. It's educated. A shadow passed across her face. Mission school, before they burned it. Gradually over the following days, the walls between them thinned. Hayes taught Naya the defensive features of the canyon, the hidden observation points, the escape tunnel dug into the western wall, the cached supplies and ammunition. She absorbed everything with the intense focus of a woman who understood that such knowledge might soon mean the difference between life and death. If they come, when they come, you'll need to be ready, Hayes told her as he demonstrated how to reload the Winchester in darkness. No hesitation, no mercy. I don't need lessons in survival from a white man, she replied. But there was no venom in her words, only the weary wisdom of someone who had been fighting to exist long before Hayes entered her life. On the 5th day, Hayes rode into Iron Horse alone, his senses alert for signs that the town had turned against him. He needed supplies, but more importantly, intelligence. The streets seemed unchanged, dusty, indifferent, caught in the torpor of midday heat. But Hayes felt eyes tracking his movement from behind drawn curtains. At Miller's General Store, the proprietor, a thin man with wire spectacles who'd once been a battlefield surgeon, greeted him with uncharacteristic tension. Sheriff Thomas arrived from Tucson yesterday, Miller murmured as he filled Hayes' order. Federal man, been asking questions about the Apache woman, says she never made it to the transport wagon. Hayes kept his expression neutral. That's so. Miller leaned closer. Wilson's offering $500 for information. Brought in some Pinkerton men, too. He paused, adjusting his spectacles nervously. They're saying you helped her escape, that it's aiding and abetting. Appreciate the warning, Hayes replied, paying for his supplies with the last of his ready cash. As he secured his purchases to his saddle, A shadow fell across him. Hayes turned slowly to find Marshal Wilson standing there, flanked by a tall man wearing a federal badge. Sheriff Thomas, presumably. "Interesting timing, Hayes," Wilson remarked. "Just when we were discussing your recent activities." Hayes met his gaze steadily. "Just resupplying. Same as always." Sheriff Thomas stepped forward, a weathered man with cold eyes and a cavalry bearing. "We have witnesses who say the Apache woman never left your jailhouse, that instead of holding her for transport as ordered, you took her yourself." His hand rested casually on his holster. "That would be a serious offense, Sheriff. Interference with federal business. Possibly even treason." "Sounds like someone's imagination is working overtime," Hayes replied evenly. "The woman escaped during the night. I reported it properly." "To whom?" Wilson demanded. "There's no record." Hayes shrugged. "Telegraph was down. Sent a rider to Fort Bowie." "Convenient," Thomas observed. "Very convenient. If there's nothing else." "Gentlemen," Hayes said, mounting his horse with deliberate slowness, "I've got rounds to make." Wilson's eyes narrowed. "We'll be watching you, Hayes. Every move." Hayes touched the brim of his hat in mocking salute and rode out of town, taking a circuitous route back to Hidden Canyon. Only when he was certain he wasn't followed did he turn toward the cabin. He found Naya on the roof, patching holes in the cedar shingles with material scavenged from the shed. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to manual labor, her hands sure and steady. When she saw Hayes approaching, she climbed down with fluid grace. "They've sent men looking for you," he informed her without preamble. "For us," she corrected, wiping sweat from her brow. "You're marked now, too." That evening, as they ate a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Naya finally shared her full story. Her husband, a peaceful man who had worked as a guide, had been killed during a raid on their settlement. Her 8-year-old son had been taken, not killed, but separated and sent to one of the government schools established to civilize Native children by stripping them of their culture, language, and identity. "I was searching for him when they captured me," she explained, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "The accusation of spying was merely convenient. They needed someone to blame for the failure of their campaign." Hayes listened in silence, his own memories surfacing unbidden. His brother Benjamin, dead at Gettysburg. The faces of Apache families he'd helped displace in the name of manifest destiny. The slow erosion of whatever ideals had once led him to pin on a badge. "My brother built this place after the Mexican War," Hayes found himself saying. "Said a man needed somewhere to remember who he was supposed to be, away from what others told him to be." He gestured to the cabin around them. "After Gettysburg took him, it became my reminder." "Of what?" Naya asked. "That there's a difference between law and justice," Hayes replied, "and a man has to choose which one he serves." The next morning, Hayes discovered fresh hoof prints in the soft earth near the creek. Someone had been scouting the area during the night. Without a word, he and Naya began preparing the cabin for defense. They positioned ammunition caches at strategic points, barricaded the windows while maintaining firing lanes, and prepared emergency provisions in case they needed to flee through the escape tunnel. "They'll come at dawn," Hayes predicted, cleaning the sharps with meticulous care. "It's what I do." Naya, loading cartridges for the Winchester, nodded in agreement. "How many?" "Wilson, Thomas, probably 4 or 5 hired guns." Hayes sighted along the sharp's barrel, checking for any impediment. "Wilson won't want witnesses, but he'll want enough men to ensure success." That night, neither of them slept. They sat on the porch, watching the stars wheel overhead, each lost in private thoughts. The silence between them had evolved from wary to companionable, the unspoken understanding of two people who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to recognize an ally against it. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Naya reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew a woven charm. Intricate patterns of sinew and bone formed into a circular design. My people believe this offers protection against enemies, she said, offering it to Hayes. Not from death, but from fear. Hayes studied it for a moment, then accepted the charm with a nod of acknowledgement. He tucked it into his shirt pocket, next to his heart. No words were necessary. The first rays of sunlight revealed 7 riders approaching from the east, more than Hayes had anticipated. Leading them was Wilson, his federal coat buttoned despite the early heat. Beside him rode Sheriff Thomas, and behind them came Maddox and 4 hard-faced men with the unmistakable look of hired killers. Bringing up the rear, his hands bound before him, was Miller, clearly brought along as a guide under duress. Hayes stepped off the porch and into the open, deliberately leaving his rifle behind. Only the revolver at his hip betrayed the possibility of resistance. Naya remained inside, positioned at the window with the Winchester, her finger resting lightly beside the trigger. Wilson reined in 20 yards from the cabin, his face flushed with what might have been the heat or might have been anticipation. "That's far enough, Hayes," he called. "We know she's in there. Make this easy on yourself and send her out." "There's nothing easy about selling human beings," Hayes replied, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Not even when you dress it up in federal orders." Thomas urged his horse forward a few steps. "This isn't about your conscience, Hayes. This is about the law. That woman is classified as a prisoner of war, and her disposition is a matter for the federal government, not some backwater sheriff with misplaced sympathies." "I've seen what passes for disposition under your authority," Hayes answered. "Seen whole families slaughtered for being on land someone else decided they wanted. Seen children torn from their parents to be civilized in schools that beat their language out of them. If that's the law, then the law's wrong." "Your personal feelings don't matter," Wilson shouted, his composure cracking. "That Apache bitch is coming with us, and you're facing charges for obstruction and treason." Hayes's hand moved a fraction closer to his holster. "You're not taking her." Wilson's face contorted with rage. "Maddox," he ordered, "shoot this fool in the legs. We'll drag him back to face trial after we've secured the prisoner." Time seemed to slow as Maddox reached for his weapon. Hayes drew with the smooth precision that came from years of practice, his first shot striking Maddox's shoulder before the hired gun could clear leather. The impact knocked Maddox from his saddle, and chaos erupted. 2 of Wilson's men opened fire, bullets splintering the wood of the cabin as Hayes dove for cover behind a water trough. From the cabin window, Naya's Winchester spoke with authoritative cracks, dropping one of the gunmen from his horse. The remaining men scattered, seeking cover among the rocks and scrub brush surrounding the clearing. Thomas took a position behind a boulder, firing methodically at Hayes's position while Wilson retreated to the tree line. Miller, still bound, had wisely thrown himself flat on the ground, making himself as small a target as possible. A bullet grazed Hayes's arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a burning furrow across his flesh. He ignored the pain, took careful aim, and put a round through the chest of a gunman who had been working his way toward the cabin's blind side. The firefight continued for what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes, a brutal, economical exchange of lead and intention. When it ended, 3 of Wilson's men lay dead in the dirt. Maddox was alive but incapacitated, clutching his shattered shoulder and cursing through gritted teeth. Wilson and Thomas had withdrawn to the trees, their horses nowhere in sight. Hayes, bleeding from his arm and a second wound along his ribs, made his way back to the cabin. Naya met him at the door, a streak of blood across her cheek where a splinter had cut her during the exchange. "They'll be back," she said, helping him inside to tend his wounds, "with more men." Hayes nodded grimly. "Not right away. They need to regroup, report casualties, gather reinforcements." He winced as she cleaned the furrow on his arm with whiskey. "But yes, they'll be back. Probably after nightfall. hoping to catch us sleeping. As dusk approached, Hayes and Naya prepared for the second assault. They had moved Miller inside. The storekeeper had sworn he'd been forced to lead Wilson to the cabin and positioned him away from potential lines of fire. The bodies of the fallen gunmen had been dragged to the edge of the clearing, their weapons and ammunition appropriated for the coming fight. "They'll try to flush us out," Hayes explained as he checked the load in his revolver. "Fire, most likely. Set the brush around the cabin burning and force us into the open." Naya nodded, her face set with grim determination. "The tunnel? Our best option. We can circle around behind them if they focus on the front of the cabin." Hayes looked at her directly. "But if something happens to me, you run. Head north toward the Dakota territory. I've got friends there who'll help you find your boy." She met his gaze steadily. "Nothing will happen to either of us." As predicted, Wilson's second assault came after nightfall. The first warning was the smell of smoke as they set fire to the dry brush surrounding the cabin. Flames leapt upward, casting writhing shadows across the walls and filling the air with choking heat. Hayes and Naya retreated to the tunnel entrance hidden behind a false wall in the root cellar. They emerged 50 yards behind the cabin just as the roof began to catch fire. In the chaos and smoke, they circled wide, using the knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. Wilson stood near the tree line, watching with satisfaction as the cabin burned. Thomas was beside him, rifle raised, watching for any sign of movement from the structure. They were so focused on the front of the cabin that they failed to notice Hayes and Naya approaching from behind until it was too late. "Drop your weapons," Hayes commanded, his revolver aimed squarely at Wilson's back. "Or the next sound you hear will be your spine shattering." Wilson froze, then slowly raised his hands. Thomas turned, his rifle half raised, but hesitated at the sight of Naya's Winchester aimed at his chest. "This isn't over, Hayes," Wilson spat as Hayes relieved him of his sidearm. "You've attacked federal officers. There's nowhere in this territory you can hide from that." "Maybe," Hayes acknowledged, "but right now you're the one staring down the barrel." He gestured for Wilson to kneel. "Put your hands behind your head." To everyone's surprise, it was Thomas who spoke next. "He's right about one thing, Hayes. This won't end here. Even if you kill us both, they'll send others. The woman will never be safe in Arizona territory." Hayes studied the federal sheriff's face, searching for deception, but finding only weary pragmatism. "What are you suggesting?" "I could report that Wilson exceeded his authority, that the prisoner died in the fire while attempting escape." Thomas glanced at the burning cabin. "It would close the case. No one in Washington cares enough about one Apache woman to investigate too deeply." Wilson's head snapped toward Thomas. "Have you lost your mind? This man is a traitor." "No," Thomas replied quietly. "He's just a man who found his line and refused to cross it." He looked back at Hayes. "I fought at Shiloh, saw what men will do to each other when they convince themselves the enemy isn't human. I'm tired of it." Hayes considered the offer, his revolver unwavering. "And what about Wilson?" Thomas's expression hardened. "Wilson's greed is well known. His sudden interest in recovering government property coincides suspiciously with rumors of private buyers paying premium prices for Native women." He paused. "I've been investigating him for months." Wilson lunged for the rifle Thomas had set aside, but Naya was faster. The butt of the Winchester connected with his temple, dropping him unconscious to the dirt. "She can't stay here," Thomas said, ignoring Wilson's crumpled form. "Not in Arizona, not even with a falsified death report. Someone will talk eventually." Hayes nodded slowly. "I know people in Dakota territory, settlers in Lakota who found a way to coexist. She'd have a chance there." "Her son?" Thomas asked. "We'll find him on the way," Hayes replied, with a certainty he didn't entirely feel, but was determined to make real. As the cabin collapsed into embers and ash, casting a red glow across the clearing, Hayes made his decision. By first light, he and Naya would be heading north, leaving behind the ashes of his brother's cabin and the weight of a badge he no longer believed in. The journey would be long and dangerous, but for the first time in years, Hayes felt the clarity of purpose that had eluded him since the war. There were laws made by men, and there was justice, and he had finally chosen which master he would serve. Dawn broke over Hidden Canyon, revealing the smoldering remains of the cabin and the beginnings of a new path. Hayes placed his badge on a flat stone near where the porch had stood, a marker for the life he was leaving behind. Beside him, Naya waited astride a dun mare, her face set toward the northern horizon and whatever fate awaited them there. "There's a long road ahead," he said as he mounted his own horse. She nodded once, her eyes reflecting the rising sun. "But not one we travel alone." Together they rode away from the ruins, two souls bound not by circumstance, but by choice. A choice to stand against the tide of history and carve out something that, if not peace, might at least be justice. Behind them, the badge caught the morning light one last time before being claimed by shadow. A relic of a law that Hayes had finally understood was not the same as doing right. "There are the laws of men," he murmured as they crested the ridge, "and the laws of honor. I choose the latter." And with that, Sheriff Jackson Hayes disappeared into legend, a man who had found his redemption not in following orders, but in defying them for something greater than himself.